blessing and a privilege to be able to stand before you.
Some of you have gotten an email that I sent out. If you haven't gotten that, it's because I don't have you on my mailing list for our newsletter. But the email that I sent out was regarding my mother. I would appreciate you all to keep her in your prayers. We found out kind of the plan of attack earlier this week, and gotten some more details on what's going to be happening. Sometime tonight, in other words, Wednesday in the U.S., she's going to be having a heart examination done, and that's to determine whether or not she can have surgery. And if that goes through, then she will be having surgery on March the 7th, and that will be to perform a hysterectomy and also to remove the lymph nodes. And that's fairly common treatment for this kind of cancer that she has. She has uterine cancer, and so we'll hopefully that will be the end of it. But we would appreciate you to keep her in your prayers. She's diabetic and just isn't in the best of health. And so the recovery and all of the things that can go with that are going to be harder for her than for others. I've heard that this is a fairly okay procedure. A lot of people have had this procedure done, but at the same time, it's a different story when your body heals at the rate that a diabetic body heals. So keep her in your prayers along those lines. I'd appreciate that. There are also a couple more pieces of news that Brother Eddie told me before. Some good news regarding Kayleen and some other news regarding Brother Ing Boon. And I'll leave that to the announcements for those to announce that. But we're excited to hear what we have about Kayleen. Talking this evening about conflict resolution in marriage. And along these lines, I want to kind of refresh our minds about last week. There's a bunch of carryover from last week. Last week we saw the beginning of conflict. Now the conflict that this couple had was a conflict based upon his needs that were not her needs. There was an expectation on his part for fulfillment in the marriage bed, and at that point she was not ready to fulfill that expectation. And so there was a conflict. He left. She went after him. She realized some of those things that she had done hastily or wrong, and desired for there to be a resolution. And so the points that we can gather from that are this. First of all, your marriage will have conflict, if it has not already. If you're in that early phase of your marriage, it's possible that you have not yet had a real knockdown, drag-out fight. But even when you're dating, you generally have some kind of conflict along these lines. It happens. When people come together that are imperfect, in which we all are, there will be conflict from time to time. But the encouraging thing to realize about that and the non-encouraging thing to realize about that is that some conflict can be avoided. But on the other hand, not all conflict can be avoided. It's just going to happen. It's an expectation that's going to be a part of our married lives. And so don't be discouraged when conflict comes up, because it came up in God's inspired example of married love. And if it comes up there, if it comes up in the example that God is holding forth for us of what marriage needs to look like, if it comes up there, then I'm fairly confident that it's going to come up for you and me as well. So don't feel bad about that. It's not about whether the conflict is going to come up. It's whether or not you're going to fight fair, as we're going to talk a bit about tonight. And ultimately whether or not you come back together again. So the three steps that we saw regarding the text from last week, we saw working towards a resolution, because we saw the conflict come up, and that's step one. Sadly, many marriages just kind of leave it at step one, where there's a feeling of harm, a feeling of hurt, a feeling of injury, and maybe there's not any talking about it, any discussion about it, but there's just a change in behavior, a change in attitude, a change in action. Well, it shouldn't be that way. And that's why the conflict doesn't stop there in God's inspired record. The second step, you see the Shulamite's perspective. She has a change of heart. She realizes that what he wants is a good thing. And newsflash, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but ladies, when your husband wants you, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. It's a good thing for there to be desire between the spouses. And that goes both ways, for a husband to desire his wife and for a wife to desire her husband. Step three, you see both spouses desiring for the conflict to come to an end. And even though the inspired perspective has been on the Shulamite side of things, we're going to see that the other side of things was more than willing. In other words, Solomon was more than willing to bring the two of them back together and to bring this resolution to a speedy end. But there's more steps to come. And that's what we're going to be talking about this evening. Now, even though most people don't like conflict, I don't know that there's many people in the world that actually enjoy conflict. They might think it's normal, it might be a part of their upbringing, and so it has become a part of their lives. But usually people don't like conflict. Even though people don't like it, the truth is that some couples never really bring it to an end. True forgiveness is never extended. Problems are never discussed to any kind of conclusion. They're swept under the rug, and they will come out again. And so the inspired example is to truly forgive. And that's what we're going to see eventually. Before forgiveness, though, has to come communication. Now, before we talk about any of those things, let's make a point that let's consider some conflict. And as we consider conflict, again, we have our perspective in the right mindset, or what is that? Perspective and mindset are the same thing. Having the right kind of mindset and perspective along these lines, whichever one you like, your approach to resolving conflict. Again, I put a question mark next to this good because I'm not sure if it really is good. In fact, I know that forgiveness is a part of the Christian life, but there can be, and there is in fact in many Christians, this attitude that I'll forgive, but I'll never forget, or I will never really bring it to a resolution. There can be this attitude in marriage of let's just agree to disagree, but that's not where God wants us to be. He doesn't want us to agree to disagree because that does not produce one flesh. One flesh does not agree to disagree. Okay? There is union, there is unity between one flesh. And that's what should exist in a marriage. And so better than that, obviously, would be to forgive from a biblical standpoint. To actually work towards a real forgiveness. But even better than that, and I want you to see that, yes, there is something better than that. Even better than that, in fact, the best thing would be to allow conflict to move you to a deeper level of love. Isn't it that the trials that we face in life can have one of two effects on us? Isn't it that trials that we face can either tear us down or, like weight training at the gym, can make us stronger? Well, if conflict in general, or if trials in general can make us stronger through proper application of ourselves to those trials, why can't that work the same way in marriage? In fact, I want you to open up these two passages with me and read them with me along these lines. James chapter 1 and verse 2, first of all. James chapter 1 and verse 2. Now it says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations." Now realize that's almost an oxymoron. You don't fall into joy when you face temptations. Well, no more is it going to seem to be immediately true when I say this. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into marital conflict. That's not how you would normally respond to that, isn't it? Nobody likes marital conflict. But how can you find joy in marital conflict? My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into marital conflict, knowing this, that the trying of your marriage will work patience. It will work patience, steadfastness. Your marriage will get stronger the more conflicts you bring to a resolution. Now, obviously, like I said, they have to be viewed the right way. But the same thing would be true of the temptations that James is speaking of. They have to be dealt with the right way. But if you bring your trials to resolution, then your marriage will be stronger. You will have a steadfast marriage, a marriage that's not going to be torn apart. And believe it or not, the more conflicts that you bring to a resolution, the less there will be in the future. And so he says, if you are following me up into this point, let steadfastness have her perfect or completing work. Let it have its completing work on your marriage. Go through these conflicts, expect them, but get through them, and let that perfect or complete your marriage. God put conflict in the world to improve us, not to defeat us. Whether it's in the form of temptations in the world, or whether it's in the form of trials and temptations within the context of marriage. Of course, verse 5 is still the true. If you don't understand all of that, then ask God for some wisdom, isn't it? Now read also Romans chapter 5 and verse 2. Romans chapter 5 and verse 2. A similar passage, in fact, a parallel text, but a different author. James wrote before, Paul writes now. And he says in Romans chapter 5 and verse 2, by whom also we have access by faith into this grace wherein we stand and rejoice in hope of the glory of God. God has called us not only to the grace of the Christian life, but marriage is a blessing from God. And as you consider the blessing that is marriage, know that you are going to have conflict, and you can do what? Verse 3, not only so, but we glory in, it says tribulations, but let's read it differently. You glory, and we glory in marital conflict, knowing that that marital conflict again works patience. Patience will work experience. Steadfastness will work as sort of experience to where you can say, I've dealt with this problem, and you can put it in the past. It doesn't have to come up again. And then what's going to happen when conflict reemerges on a different subject? You're going to have this. Experience works hope. You're going to realize, hey, we can get through this. We can get through this. And that's what will happen in your marriage. You'll get stronger if you deal with conflict. Let's talk about some sources, some common sources of real conflict within marriages. Even though there are unique problems that can come up in marriage that we are not going to, for the sake of time or for the sake of ability, address, there's all kinds of things that can happen in marriage. Generally speaking, if you ask marital counselors, they'll give you 4 or 5 things that are the most common complaints that married couples come in with. And let's consider some of these. But before we do that, I want to consider this. There's a news flash that I want to give you. If you haven't realized this yet, we all have annoying habits. All right? If you're wondering about your spouse-to-be, if you're wondering about that person that you're dating, you know, in dating, we all like to put on the best possible face that we possibly can, and so ladies are caking themselves up with makeup, guys are spraying the cologne and putting on the deodorant, and all of the table manners are there, all of the politenesses are there, and all of the things are as they should be. And you might think, well, because that's the image that I'm getting, that's the way it's always going to be. The newsflash is, everyone has annoying habits, including me. All right? We all have annoying habits. And so don't think, and this goes back to the dating side of things, don't think that you're going to be able to find someone who does not have annoying habits. But within the context of marriage, don't think that annoying habits constitute real conflict. All right? Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't grow out of our habits to the ability that we can. What are habits, rather, but behavior repeated over time. And so if you change your behavior, you can have new habits. But in spite of your best efforts, some of those old habits will sometimes come out. Realize that those things are not the source of real conflict. My wife sent me a link that she got, I think, from Facebook, and it's an article that I'd recommend reading. I don't know who this man is or where this came from. My wife gets these things through Facebook, and the world is very beyond my understanding. But anyway, this is the quote from the article that I found especially interesting. And he's talking about, the article is called, "I Wasn't Ready for Marriage." And what he goes on to say basically is that you're never really ready for marriage. You just have to kind of do it. You're never going to be really ready for marriage. There's always going to be things that you haven't considered in a right way. And then he goes on to say this. In fact, there is, as far as I can tell, only one form of not ready that should possibly stop you from walking down the aisle. In other words, from getting married. What is that one thing that should stop you from getting married? Your own immaturity. Your own immaturity. If you are prepared to dump someone you profess to love because they chew with their mouth open or leave a wet towel on the floor, you have a maturity issue. And remember, it is your issue. It's not their issue, it's your issue. Because your attitude about marriage is wrong. That's superficial. And you're going to find in the first couple of years of marriage especially, and even as marriage continues, that you're going to do little things that annoy each other. It's just going to happen. But that's not real conflict, and it shouldn't be treated like that. I hate to have examples from my family, and I'm not going to use any from my personal family unless it's about me, but my sister is divorced now. And one point in her relationship with her husband, Chris, my ex-brother-in-law, who I wish was still my brother-in-law. He was not a Christian, but he was a good man. He did some laundry. Now, here's something you realize about my sister, even more so back then than she is now. She used to be very particular about things, very, very particular about things. I remember there was a time when our house was continually messy. And so I took it upon myself, we had a really messy kitchen. I took it upon myself to clean the kitchen and to create a duty roster for the members of the family to clean the kitchen. This is what you do when you're what we call in America a latchkey kid, when you don't have any parents. You just kind of come up with parenting yourself. And so I created a duty roster where each of us would take turns cleaning the kitchen. Well, Mom wouldn't do it. That's when she was outside, when she had actually left the church for a period of time. Dad did it for a little while, but when my sister found out I had this plan, she came into the kitchen. She said, "You haven't cleaned the kitchen." And then she spent the next couple of hours re-cleaning the kitchen. That's the kind of woman that she is. "You haven't cleaned the kitchen. Now it's clean." Well, Chris did laundry for the family. Ladies, you like that? My sister didn't like that. And what did she do? Because he did laundry the wrong way, she made him sleep on the couch for a week. Ladies, your men are going to be oxymorons, or maybe just morons, when it comes to doing some things around the house. All right? Realize that about them. And their annoying habits, they're not the source of real conflict. Now, she allowed that annoying habit to become a real conflict by depriving my brother-in-law of the marriage bed. I was quite proud of it. She told my mom about it. That's the only way I know about it. So that's not good, all right? It's not good. So, common sources of conflict and their solutions, all right? Let's talk about some real things that cause conflict. Even still, you're going to say, well, maybe they shouldn't, but they will. Okay, so first of all, along these lines, financial difficulties or money matters is a major source of conflict. And I have to believe besides what I'm going to point out later as the number one source of conflict, this would be a close second, particularly here in Singapore. We are a very money-conscious society, very and overly concerned with money, how it's used, who gets to spend it, and so on. Well, let's offer some solutions to this. First of all, this is just good financial management. Do not live beyond your means. I bought one thing in my life on credit and paid back by installments. It was my very first computer when I left school. When I left my home to go to Memphis School of Preaching, I bought a computer and I paid it off in installments. And the reason I did that was to create a credit history. And since that time, I have never looked back. I do have credit cards, but I never carry a balance. All right, and I think that's the way that those things should be used. Never carry a balance. Live within your means. Because when you get into this habit of living beyond your means, I read this quote somewhere recently, and I can't remember who said it. It was an author, a famous author, but the quote goes something like this: "Bankruptcy comes all at once, slowly, and then suddenly." Have you ever heard that kind of term before? Well, it comes slowly because you're spending, life is good, spending, and then all of a sudden, oh no, I can't actually pay this back. All right? And some people are actually swimming in debt. There is a picture of a man, there was a commercial rather, in the U.S. with a man who was in front of a beautiful house, and you could see the car and the boat, and he's riding on his lawnmower and he's smiling, and he says, "I'm in debt up to my eyeballs." And that's the way that some people live. But it's not the way that we should live as Christians. Why? Don't let your life be full of covetousness. Be content. That's actually a commandment in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5. Be content with whatsoever things as you have. All right? Live within your means. What God gives you, He gives you to enjoy. You don't need to be selfish with what you earn or what you have. and always trying to have more and spend, ridiculous amounts of money on things that don't really matter. But at the same time, we enjoy these things, but live within your means. Live within your means. Second, create a family budget. In other words, where is the money going to go? And have it set. Have it set in place where this much money is going to go to this much money is going to go to that. This helps you, by the way, with a lot of things. It helps you with giving on Sunday so that you know exactly how much you're giving, what proportion you're giving relative to your blessings or your income. And it also helps you to avoid some of these fights that come up. And along those lines, always discuss expenditures outside of the budget together. When there's going to be a step beyond that budget that's been set, talk about it with each other. Make sure that you both are enthusiastic. And I think in one of those marriage books I read, it talked about the value of enthusiastic agreement. In other words, not just grudging agreement, but enthusiastic agreement, where both spouses are happy with that solution to that problem, whatever it might be. Assign roles relative to money based on talent. You're going to find in marriage that one of you is probably, hopefully, a saver and one of you is a spender. If both of you are spenders, woe be unto you, all right? You're going to have a hard time. But hopefully, one of you is a saver, one of you is a spender. Well, who should be the one who handles the money in that marriage? Well, it should be the saver. The saver should be the one who handles the money, who sets the budget, and so on. There's been marriages where that's the guy. There's been marriages where that's the girl. There's nothing wrong with either one doing that job. It needs to be the one who does it and who can do it consistently. For my parents, I remember that it was my mom, because my dad, when he was entrusted to pay the bills, he would forget. And that brought a lot of conflict into their marriage because of that. So assign roles relative to money based on talent. And then finally, while mad money is okay, avoid the concept of his and her money. What is mad money? This is something that was introduced to me when I was in 11th grade. My history teacher told me about this. And mad money is basically where you have a bit of money that you as the husband or you as the wife, it's like an allowance. You do whatever you want to do with it. It's not very much. But if you want something, and however you spend that money, you don't argue about it. We had this working in our time in Melbourne when my wife was working one job and I was working another job. At that time, we had this where I had a certain amount. It was $25 a week for the two of us. So I got $25. She got $25. She would spend her $25 on coffee. And all of it would be spent on coffee. I don't know if she minds me saying that, but coffees are expensive in Melbourne. They're not $1 like they are here out back. And so she would spend all of hers on coffee. I would usually spend none of it and just save it up. And that kind of tells you where we're at anyway. But whatever she did with that money, I wasn't allowed to say a thing about it. And whatever I did with that, she wasn't allowed to say a thing about it. It just, and oftentimes because of my natural characteristics, I've always been tempted to step over that line and say something about it, but I shouldn't, all right? And I've learned better as we've gone on in the marriage. It's good to have that, I think. I don't know, it's not scriptural, not biblical. I just think it's a good idea. But what I think is a bad idea is for you to have these separate checking accounts, and where you have his pot of money and her pot of money. And I've seen couples that have done this. And even though that might be a reality of the part of the world in which we live, I don't know, it might be inconvenient for you to combine your finances, maybe something along those lines, but the danger is you start living two separate lives. And that's exactly what you don't want. Is this a thou shalt, or is this a commandment of God? Certainly not. But I think that wisdom would say that as much as we can be one flesh, we're going to be one flesh. And so have a joint checking account. Allow each other to know how the family's money is being spent. And because what can happen with this is, let's just say there is a situation where you've got his money, her money, and he is assigned over this set of bills, she's assigned over this set of bills, he's paying them, she's paying them. What happens if now she's got into the habit, or he's got into the habit of just using the rest of that money however they want to use it, or however she or he wants to use it? What happens if for some reason one of them loses the job? Well, then you've got this habit created of spending independently, but you don't have the resources to maintain it. Okay? And so what's going to happen then, his money or her money, whoever loses the job, is going to dry up into nothing. And then he or she will be tempted to use the other person's money and use it as carelessly as they did previously. And that's just one kind of thing that can happen. Of course, it's a lot easier to do things that are not right, to cheat on a spouse, to pay for private vacations or these kinds of things. It's a lot easier to do that when you have separate pools of money. So combine them and let them know what's happening along those lines and share financial details openly. So, second conflict that can come up, sexual difficulties can come up and be a real conflict situation in marriage. Now, the first solution that I want to give you is a biblical one. You need to make a commitment, first of all, to not cheat on your spouse. What does that mean? It means to not go outside of the marriage bed. But you also need to make a commitment not to cheat your spouse. What do I mean by that? Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 3 with me. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 3. Now notice how the marriage bed is referred to here in this text. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence. Due benevolence. Benevolence is good doing. And it's due. In other words, it's like a payment. You know, have you ever had a due date before for an assignment or a task? Well, what does that mean? It means it's owed on this occasion. Well, you owe something to your spouse. Due benevolence. Render husbands what you owe to your wife. Likewise also wives, render to what you owe to your husband. And notice what this is really talking about in case you haven't gotten it. The Bible's not veiled in what it's talking about here. Verse 4, the wife has not power of her own body, but the husband. And likewise also the husband has not power of his own body, but the wife. And so what does he say not to do? Defraud or cheat not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourself to fasting and prayer, and come together again after that. There may be some special circumstance that for some reason causes you to have to be apart from the marriage bed for a short period of time. But let that be with consent, with enthusiastic agreement from both husband and wife, and let it be only for a season. Now there's only one reason given in the Bible. I know that we try to invent other reasons, but what does it say? Prayer and fasting, in other words, spiritual reasons. We try to say everything under the sun is a reason to live apart from each other. Really, it's not. But, okay, if you have consent for a period of time, okay, but come back together again. It should be that both spouses are fulfilled in the marriage relationship, both husband and wife. And that might be specifically of the sexual relationship. It might be the things that happen around that sexual relationship, the kind of affection, the kind of words of praise, or whatever else, as we've talked about previously, his needs or her needs are. But those needs need to be met. If you have physical problems with this part of your life, I'm not capable or qualified to talk about these problems or give you an easy solution. I've given you that reference of the book previously, a couple weeks back. If you weren't here for that, you can ask me about that book afterwards. But Christian literature and ultimately doctors could be consulted if you have physical problems. If there's some kind of extramarital problem, something in the past that has created some problems. You know, there are marriage relationships where they come together as husband and wife, and the wife has terrible problems with that, and the reason is because she has blocked it out of her mind, but she was actually raped or abused when she was a child. All right, well, that's not an excuse. All right, it's a terrible thing. It's not an excuse. Work through it. Get professional help. Counselor to work through those kinds of things, and then to come back together again. If there's been an affair or adultery, then obviously that also needs professional counseling. It's not something that you can just ignore. Third problem that comes up oftentimes in marital conflict is problems with in-laws. And along these lines, solutions to that would, of course, first of all be to do what you should do in marriage in the first place. You have to draw a clear line between your family and your parents. Has to happen. Now, ideally, that's a geographic line where when you get married, you're going to be not living in the same house. that creates problems. Might not in every culture, but ideally, I would think that there would be some geographic space. If not geographic space, then there should at least be this understanding that these are two distinct families now. That the husband is answerable to the wife is answerable to the husband, and neither one is answerable in terms of obedience to the decrees of or the commandments of the parents anymore. All right? They have become one. And so no more is it, well, mom said to do this or dad said to do this. It's now, what have we decided as a married family to do? That line needs to be drawn. Husband and wife are to leave father and mother. Genesis 2:24, when marriage was instituted. Second, though, realize that you have a duty, a God-given responsibility to care for your parents. This is not cultural. This is beyond culture. This is every nation around the world. Now, it manifests itself differently in every culture. In this culture, it might be making payments to your parents regularly. That kind of thing is unfathomable for a Westerner. It's always that the parents don't, rather the children don't lay up for the parents, but the parents for the children in Western culture. And so the idea of making regular payments is just not there. But, and there have been times where this has happened, where you have a parent that gets in trouble with money, a hospital bill needs to be paid or something along those lines. Well, of course, children need to respond to that. It might be that there is a time when your parents physically can't take care of themselves. And then there will be a necessity for you to spend a great deal of time with your parents. In fact, I know of one married couple where the wife doesn't work. And the reason is because she spends a great deal of her time ferrying her mother back and forth to these kind of appointments. I know a lot of couples like that, to be honest, where there has to be almost continual care for these people once they've gotten this point in their lives. So that needs to happen. You need to take care of your parents. You have to learn piety at home. In fact, in 1 Timothy 5:3 it says, requite or pay back your parents. And that's what children should do. And they should honor father and mother along those lines. But in order to avoid conflict when all of that has to happen, discuss early and regularly. In other words, as your marriage grows and as it progresses, talk about, all right, we're now moving to this house. What does that mean for our parents? All right, I'm now taking this job. What does that mean for our parents? Because it might be that, we have to do this or that. It's been the understanding in our marriage relationship, for example, that my mom is in much worse health. My mom is about 20 years older than my wife's parents. And so because of that, she's going to have more health problems sooner. And along those lines, we've always said that there's an escape clause for my mission work. When my mom needs me, I pull the plug. I'm going back home. And that's just what I have to do along those lines. So you discuss these what-if situations regularly relative to your parents' health. Now, fourth common source of conflict can be disagreement over children or child rearing. And along these lines, that disagreement can take a lot of forms where the husband wants one thing for the children's future, the wife another thing. It could be disagreement over how we're going to discipline, and all kinds of things can come up along these lines. Well, realize, first of all, that the best thing that you can possibly give your child are two parents that love each other. And I would even go so far as to say this: it's more important for you to love your spouse than it is for you to love your child. Now that might seem harsh, and I'm not saying that you need to go about ranking along these lines as to who's more important or whatever, but your child needs to see a functioning relationship. It needs to be modeled for him or her. And so you have to set the example, because you're influencing with the way that you behave in marriage, believe it or not, is actually influencing the next generation. How many children of divorced people end up getting divorced? High percentage rating. How many children where they have grown up in an abusive home, where there's been abuse between the husband and the wife? How many of them repeat that when they become their own man or woman along those lines? And so we're shaping the next generation. The best thing that we can do for our child is to love our spouse. And along those lines, I would recommend you need date nights, weekly if possible, where you're saying, all right, calling up mom and dad, calling up babysitter, whoever it might be, the two of us are going to go and have a date, just like we did when we were dating in the first place. And the reason that you do that is because what will happen is, and what does happen in many marriages, is all of the focus goes on to these kids, right? And then you bring up these children, and then they leave the home, and what do you have then after all these years of bringing up children? You have two people who don't know each other anymore. They've changed. They've evolved over time. And you will find that there are certain peaks in divorce rates. There's a peak around the 7-year mark, and it's called, in the U.S., it's called the 7-year itch. It was so funny, George got up in chapel, George Zong, one of the graduating class from last year, and he called it the 7 itching years. I guess there's something lost in translation there, but the same basic concept apparently existed in China, the 7 itching years, or the 7-year itch as we call it. And so around that 7-year mark, it seems to be that a lot of marriages fall apart. Well, there's also, it then tapers off after that point, but then there's a spike in that period of time where the children would normally be sent out. And that's because what you have are what are called empty nesters who have become birds of a different feather, so to speak. They don't know each other anymore. And so you have to have these times, dates, holidays where just the husband and wife are involved with that. Time with each other to reconnect, to bond, and to make sure that nothing is lost along those lines. Second, you have to present a unified front to your children. Children are to obey their parents, plural. But children are very smart. You don't know how smart children are. They will turn one parent on another. And you say, no, that would never happen. I've seen it happen. It actually happens, and I've seen it happen here. And one of the things, and children get to be very smart at a very young age. One of the funniest things between me and my wife that we do sometimes is to watch children cry and the way parents respond to that. Because children, there's a difference between a I'm hurting cry and an I want attention cry. And we've seen a lot of parents right here in Singapore where the baby will, or the little toddler will be offering up a I want attention cry, the wah, 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 that kind of cry. And the parents will go, oh baby, what do you want? I'll give you anything that you want, or something along those lines. Well, that sets the stage for a child who's going to turn parents on each other, okay? Parents need to present a unified front. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8 is a beautiful text. We were just talking about this today at school. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8. Hebrew parallelism is such that the first phrase is basically the same as the second phrase. Watch this. My son, hear the instruction of thy father. Forsake not the law of thy mother. Are those two different things? No, in Hebrew parallel structure, they are the same. The father is the same as the mother. The instruction of the father, the same as the law of the mother. They are presenting to their child a unified front. Never will it be the case that the parents are arguing about a decision in regards to the child. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Now, the number one source of conflict, if this is not a surprise to you, or this is a surprise to you, then it shouldn't be. Number one source of conflict in marriage is either poor communication or poorly communicating. In other words, sometimes communication just is not there, or sometimes communication is there, but it's not the right kind. But at the end of the day, what's the problem? It's communication. And so that's where the bulk of our work needs to be done, because if you have proper communication, before money becomes a problem, you talk about it. Before sexual issues become a problem, you talk about it. Before in-laws become a problem, you talk about it. Before children become a problem, you talk about it. Communication is the number one thing that we can develop in our marriages to try to resolve conflict in an effective way. And so as we think about that, step 4 in the relationship between Solomon and the Shulamite is communication. But it's very, very interesting that in this presentation of married love, while God does not share any discussion that Solomon and the Shulamite might have had, it's clear that this couple did not allow conflict to destroy their communication. Why? Because he has made an appeal She has acted rashly. She's going to seek after him. And when we do introduce ourselves again to Solomon, in other words, when she finds him and when they finally talk about this, he talks first, and it's not to say anything bad. And we're going to find out exactly what he says later on. So, along those lines, though, we might not be there. All right? Our relationship is going to have conflict. Theirs had conflict. Our relationship, though, might have to learn how to communicate effectively, whereas theirs, it appears, already had learned how to communicate effectively. This is a list of do's and don'ts, and a lot of these are influenced by that book I referenced last week, and so you can see that and compare his with mine. They're very similar along those lines because I've used him as my source. I've changed a few things here and there. First thing, do not speak too quickly. Do not speak too quickly. And we know the statement of James, let everyone be slow to hear, isn't it? Not quick to speak. Slow to, or what does it say? Quick, what does it say? I've messed it up, haven't I? Quick to speak. All right, what does it say? Quick to hear, slow to speak. All right, what did I say before? Oh, well, anyway. That would be bad, wouldn't it be? Quick to hear, slow to speak. All right, now we've got it. Quick to hear, slow to speak. In other words, just take time. Take time to process all the information. Listen fully, listen deeply. And along those lines, as you are not speaking, be mindful that sometimes you can be saying the right thing, but if you say the right thing at the wrong time, it's not welcome. In Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 14, Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 14, he that blesseth his friend, is that a good thing? Yes. But notice how he blesseth his friend. He that blesseth his friend with a loud voice, rising early in the morning, it shall be counted a curse to him. And there's a lot of truth to that, isn't there? Saying the right thing at the wrong time is not going to be received very well. If you wake up, if you wake up in the morning and you say, "Good morning, honey, it's a great day," and you do all of that, don't be surprised if your spouse is not a morning person, that's not going to be received very well. That's actually what that proverb is literally picturing. Now, that refers to any number of situations where you might have the best possible thing to say in the world, and you're just waiting for it. Give me the opportunity to say this best, beautiful thing. Well, it might be the best thing in the world, but there might be a wrong time to say it. Be slow in your speaking. Speak softly and sweetly, not harshly. A couple of proverbs along these lines realize what happens when you speak harshly and the need for speaking softly. Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 1, a soft answer turns away wrath, but grievous words or unpleasant words stir up anger. And so soft speaking. Learn how to be calm. Learn how to convey your emotions reasonably. In chapter 16 and verse 21, it says, the wise in heart shall be called prudent, and the sweetness of the lips increases learning. The way that you say something is directly related to how well it's received. So speak sweetly. In fact, in verse 24, pleasant words are as a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and health to the bones. So speak sweetly. And be surprised how big of an impact that has on your marriage communication. Third, confront your spouse in private, never in public. Jesus spoke on conflict. Now, he didn't speak on marriage conflict, but he spoke on conflict in general. And what are you supposed to do in conflict? When you have a problem with your brother, and believe it or not, your spouse is your brother in that sense, or your sister. Especially so if you're Christians, but even if you're not Christians together, in other words, if one of you is a Christian and one of you is not, there's still a relationship there that needs to be maintained. And so along those lines, what does Jesus say should happen if there's conflict between two people? In Matthew chapter 18 and verse 15, notice the specific instructions along these lines. Does he say to tell everyone about it? Does he say to post it up on Facebook? You'll never believe what my wife said. You'll never believe what my husband said. Nope. Matthew chapter 18 and verse 15. Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him. Alone. You got it? Alone. Alone. Too quick. We're very, very quick today in an era where we all like to be right. And we all like for everybody to say we're right. We're too quick to run to places like Facebook and say, can you believe what this person did? And that this person can sometimes be our spouse. And it'll get 100 likes, and everybody will be commenting, yeah, I hope you told him, or whatever it is that is happening in that situation. Well, okay, all right. That's not what Jesus wants you to do. Alone. Handle it alone. Never confront your spouse in front of your children or involve your children. Look at Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 1. Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 1. Private needs to be considered not just out of public eye, but also out of the family's eye. There's a good reason for doing this. Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 1. Better is a dry morsel, a tiny little piece of food, and quietness therewith, than a house full of sacrifices. Other versions render that something along the line of feasting. In other words, you've got a lot of animal sacrifices, you've got a house full of meat. If you've got a house full of meat in this period of time, you're very blessed. You have a lot of resources. But better is a dry morsel, a tiny little piece of bread with quietness, than a house full of sacrifices with strife. Don't let your children grow up with parents arguing around them. Even if that means that you have to take lesser jobs, even if it means you have to have less money, even if it means you can't go on family vacations, whatever it takes, make sure that your children have quietness at home. Now, there will be conflict. And conflict really, even though you're trying to speak softly, conflict isn't always going to be quiet. But it can be quietly kept from children. You don't have to argue. You asked me about the memories that I have of sitting there doing my homework and both of my parents arguing above my head. I remember one time they were doing that and they were arguing back and forth, yelling at each other and just saying, and then finally one of them realized he's trying to do his homework. But they had no sentimentality or no idea of trying to keep that away from me. It's terrible. It's a bad, bad thing for a child to grow up in. Avoid these words when you're talking to your spouse. Avoid never and avoid always. What does that look like? You always do this. Now, is that a true statement? No. There's not a person in the world who always does anything. Not even breathing in, because every now and then you have to breathe out, right? There's not a person in the world who always does anything. All right? And conversely, there's not a person in the world, is that conversely, or I don't remember the word, but on the other hand, there's not a person in the world who never does anything. You never do that. Well, that's not true. Throw those words out of the vocabulary. Don't tell lies when you're having conflict with your spouse. Never resort to name calling. Our Lord wanted to put us above that in terms of our relationship with others, calling people fool and using other insults along those lines. I never have been tempted to call someone raka or whatever, however you say that. But there are similar words that we can all think of. They don't belong in the marriage relationship. Do not use words like stupid. Don't say shut up. That's what teenage kids do to each other when they're having an argument. Don't say shut up to your spouse. Don't use rude words. Don't use name calling along those lines. When an issue comes up in your marriage, it shouldn't be, we've talked about using soft words, it shouldn't be that you're hysterical, But it also shouldn't be that you're historical. You've all probably heard that one before. You know, he gets hysterical, she gets historical. What does that mean? Well, brings up all those things that have happened in the past. Well, as best as we can, Christians, we are to be like our God. And what happens when sins are forgiven? They are forgotten. 2 times, in case we couldn't remember it, God says to us, in the new covenant, their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. And that should be the way it is in marriage, really, where we never bring up old arguments again. Once they're solved, they're gone. That's the way that it should be. Leave the past in the past. Never leave an argument without a calm explanation. There are going to be times, and in fact, I know that I grew up in with this kind of issue. I had a terrible temper growing up. And my mom would tell me, one of the good things that she did in parenting, she would tell me, you need to go outside and you need to run around the block. Or you need to go outside, and one of the things she would tell me to do, you need to go chop some wood. And that's almost impossible to imagine here in Singapore, I understand that. But I would do that, you know, and I would go exert myself in some kind of physical way, and after that I would calm down. And I would be able to think clearly to be able to figure out whatever it was bothering me so much in the first place. So there might be times where you're that kind of person, where you just need a little bit of time to process the information. Okay, acknowledge that about yourself and say, I just need a little bit of time to take this in. Don't say it harshly. Don't slam the door. Don't run away. But in a very soft way, just say, all right, I need some time to think about this. And then come back and talk about it. But talk about it before the sun goes down. Let not the sun go down on your wrath. That's what Paul said. Not that Paul, Apostle Paul. Let not the sun go down on your wrath. I saw Paul nodding vigorously to that, and so I thought, well, anyway. Don't let the sun go down on your wrath. It means handle the problem there. You know, God gave us anger. It's a part of our emotional makeup. Jesus got angry. And if Jesus got angry, then I can feel okay when I get angry. Why did God give us anger? Because what anger does is it forces our mind to focus on one thing. And the idea is that when we focus on one thing, we'll keep on focusing on it until we give a resolution to it. That's good. That's very good. Because sometimes people can just sweep it under the rug and forget about it. Problems need to be solved, but they don't need to linger and fester. Because if you leave it overnight, it gets bigger. And it gets bigger and it gets bigger. But along those lines, be mindful of this. While the above is true, remember that late night is not a good time to fight. You get cranky as you get later into the night. At least I do. And you're not reasoning clearly. All right? So what happens? It's not that you just cut off a conflict, mid-conflict, and say, I got to go to sleep now. Well, it should be, though, that you're mindful of the time. You can choose when to bring issues up. You can choose when to talk about things. Sometimes you can't because your spouse brings it up. But if you have a choice in the matter, say, all right, we'll talk about this in the morning. And the reason that you do that is because, on the one hand, not only are you not thinking well late at night, but on the other hand, you know, problems look a lot better in daylight. True story. If you're in a well-lit room discussing very serious things, that well-lit room will have an impact on the way you view those things. In fact, depression, you don't know this in Singapore, but in places where there's winter, the days get very short. Depression is directly correlated to the shortening of the days. And there's a spike in suicides during the winter months in those places that have very harsh winters and very little daylight. And that's because light does something. Okay. Next, never bring up the parents, you're just like your father, or my mother never did it this way. That's not a good idea. That's not a good idea. I remember Paul and Jean Bowers, a lovely couple until Paul, of course, passed away. They were married for over 50 years, if I remember right. They told me, though, that Paul made a mistake when they first got together. The first morning that Paul woke up to, and lovely Jean had made a breakfast, and she'd made biscuits, a very Southern American breakfast. And he sat down, and he took a bite of those biscuits, and he said, "That's not the way my mama made them." Well, he didn't get any more biscuits for 50 years of their marriage, he didn't get any more biscuits for breakfast. And so that's the danger that you run. And they joked about it, of course, but he didn't give him any biscuits. So don't say, my mother used to do it that way. All right, along those lines. Remember that your goal is to resolve the conflict and restore the relationship, not to win an argument. One of the best things I could do for my faith in terms of being able to reason out things was to take a debate class. Interestingly, that was also the worst thing for my marriage. All right? You get this temptation where you just want to win the argument. But winning an argument does not win the war, okay? It does not solve the conflict. When you can string together logical things, especially guys, when you can string together all these logical things and make it make perfect sense, well, newsflash again, you might think that you've won, but you won't win. All right? If she does not enthusiastically agree with however that conflict comes to an end, you haven't really won. It's going to come back and it's going to hurt you. Why don't I do that? Avoid a know-it-all or a holier-than-thou attitude. Remember this when you're having these kind of arguments. Let him that is without sin cast the first stone. John chapter 8 and verse 7. Just remember that. You have done things wrong. Do not approach your arguments with the attitude that you've not done anything wrong. It's a hard thing, but yes, you have done wrong, and be ready to apologize when that is pointed out. Replace the you statements with your arguments with the I feel statements. How is that better? What's the difference between saying you did this and saying I feel like this? Believe it or not, there's actually a big difference between those two things. When you're saying I feel, the statement is not about what you have or have not done. It's about how I feel. It's true. But when I say you did this, it might be that I'm not accurately understanding whatever it is my spouse has done. And so it's not a fair statement along those lines. Don't say you did, say I feel to the best of your ability. And never raise a hand in anger. Where all men are working towards being no strikers, no brawlers along those lines. Never raise a hand in anger, and listen patiently, attentively, respectively, and completely before speaking. Patiently means you wait before you speak. Attentively means you actually pay attention. You don't do two things at once. You're not listening to the sports while you're listening to her problems. Respectfully means that you're not rolling your eyes and you're not, taking defiant stances along those lines. Listen respectfully and listen completely. Hear them out until the very end before you speak. Now, I've said all of that because conflict affects us in this way and because communication will be a major problem for us. Here, I keep going with these things. I'm sorry. Allow conflict to stay within the marriage. I'm going to skip past these because we're coming to an end. All right. Step 5, forgiveness. After you've come through communication should come forgiveness. And I find it very interesting. We're going to resolve this pretty quickly, this lesson. I mean, not necessarily the conflicts in your life. But while conflict still existed in God's example of married love, the communication to resolve it is missing. We don't have a record of that. I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I'm saying we don't have a record of it. But what we do have is very, very interesting. Song of Solomon chapter 6 and verse 4. In verse 3, the Shulamite is looking for her husband, and where does she find him? She finds him at work, providing for the family. But then in verse 4, what happens? Solomon speaks. And he doesn't say, you shouldn't have done that last night. He doesn't say, where have you been? He doesn't say, why didn't you open the door? He doesn't wait in silence for her to explain herself. What does he do? He says, thou art beautiful, O my love, as Tirzah, comely as Jerusalem. Terrible, now that doesn't mean the same thing as it means today, awesome or awe-inspiring, as an army with banners. What is he really saying with all of this? I'm overcome by your love. Turn away your eyes from me, for they have overcome me. Thy hair is as a flock of goats. Now that's again language between him and his wife. That doesn't make a lot of sense for us today. Don't use the same thing. Your hair is as a flock of goats. Well, it doesn't quite work. And again, Solomon really liked teeth. He must have had to look at a lot of people that had some bad teeth or something. I don't know. But thy teeth are as a flock of sheep which go up from the washing, whereof every one beareth twins. What does this remind you of? The things that he said to her on his wedding night. That love is still there. It's rekindled. Even though there's been this conflict, he still loves her and he's expressing his love to her. There is not one barren among them as a piece of a pomegranate, so are the temples within thy locks. Describing her with these same terms of beauty and wonder and awe that he had on their wedding night. Rather than responding to their conflict with silence, or even worse, responding with anger, Solomon greets his spouse with compliments. Now, I know that's not an easy thing to do when you feel like your spouse has harmed you, or wronged you, or cheated you of your needs. But you know how that will improve your marriage if you can do it? A lot. We all have a lot of learning to do, I know, on this. I know I have a lot of learning to do on this. But the more that you can incorporate these things into your marriage relationship, the better your marriage will be. And it shouldn't be a surprise. Because are we Christians? Yes. And if we're Christians, what should we do? We don't render evil for evil. Do you think that only applies when you're talking to people in the world? Do you think that only applies when you're talking to people in the church? No, in your marriage relationship, do not render evil for evil, railing or insult for insult, but contrariwise, blessing, knowing that you were called to that. You were called to bless people. You were called to make people's lives better, not to return evil for evil, not to return insult for insult. It's not eye for eye, it's not tooth for tooth, it's blessing for cursing. That's what it should be. That's what you were called to. And it's only on that ground that you yourself will be blessed, so that you can inherit, he says, a blessing. Conflict is real. Conflict really needs to be dealt with. But we have a choice in how we deal with it. The question is, are we going to be vultures or are we going to be eagles? I don't know about you, but do you ever get in your mind, I don't know, you might not know these birds from anything, all right? So I'm running the risk of that, of course. Go to Singapore Bird Park, Jurong Bird Park, very nice place, all right? Go watch the shows and things with the vultures. You'll notice the vultures, what do? When you imagine a vulture in your mind, if you can, do you imagine a vulture majestically soaring across the landscape? How do you imagine a vulture? Sitting down and picking the carcass. It's quite funny to watch these birds walk around and they're like, eating. And that's the picture that you get. Well, that's what your marriage can be like, where conflict is a carcass. And you pick at it, and pick at it, and pick at it, and pick at it. And that's the picture of your marriage. That's what your marriage will ultimately be. You'll be vultures picking at each other until you die. That's not very nice, is it? But when you picture an eagle, our nation's bird is the bald eagle. And don't cite me too hard on this. Sometimes bald eagles do, yes, eat carcasses. But when you get a picture of a bald eagle in your mind, what's the picture that you get? It might not be the same as mine, but a majestic soaring bird. And I'm not alone in that. Isaiah said, they shall mount up with wings like vultures? No, eagles. Eagles. All right? Now, I know that eagles have to go to earth to eat at one point or another. But that's not what characterizes them in my mind. I know that even the best marriages have conflict. But there are some marriages where that doesn't characterize them in my mind. When I consider that couple, I don't view them like vultures, I view them like eagles. So the question is, which do you want to be? Do you want to be the vulture, or do you want to be the eagle? And the way you deal with conflict or don't will determine directly how you do that. Solomon was able, yes, I know there needs to be forgiveness. I know it needs to be in the sense where you deal with the problem and all of this, but Solomon was able to set aside his hurt and to reinvigorate that love, talking about those things, returning blessing for cursing. And what a great example that would be for us. Shulamite. I go down into the garden, I should say I go down to the garden, or I went down, I think, into the garden of nuts to see the fruits of the valley and to see whether the vine flourished, the pomegranates budded. And so she's going into the garden that is her husband. She wants to see what's it going to be like. Is he angry at me? Is he? How's he going to respond to what I've done? Before I was even aware, I was like I was on a chariot. We were flying once again. Now it would be perfect if she used the eagle illustration for me, but she didn't. She used a chariot. And so whereas she had feared that her love had come to a stop, Solomon allowed their love to be like a chariot speeding off into the sunset. Isn't that nice? And that's what forgiveness can be within marriage relationships. Step 6 to marital conflict, therefore, is greater closeness and joy. One passage and then the lesson will be yours. The Shulamite says, or actually this is probably the audience that says this, and the Shulamite maybe responds, but return, O Shulamite. She doesn't say that, of course, but return, that we may look upon thee. What will you see in the Shulamite? As it were, the company of two armies. Now, you compare that with all the versions you'll like, and it will only confuse you more. But the common thread among every other version but the King James Version is the idea of dancing. And there'll be different ways of explaining that. The American Standard Version, I put the dance of Mahanaim. And the reason I left that up there is because no one knows what that means, all right? So we'll just say Mahanaim and we'll leave it at that. But what do we know about? We do know about dancing. Now, where I don't think that dancing has a place between two unmarried people, I believe that dancing or dancing-like things, I've never had dancing lessons, so I don't know how to dance, but dancing-like things happen between husbands and wives, and they should. And so what are you going to see when you look at the Shulamite and Solomon? You're going to see two people dancing. After genuine forgiveness, people should be able to see two people united as if in a joyous dance, their marriage strengthened through trials. Isn't again that just another beautiful picture of what your marriage could be if you will overcome the trials that face it? We need to learn how to communicate. That's going to solve a lot of our problems. And how I wish I could talk more about that. The book actually had 20 things to help your communication. I might have gotten it down to 18 or 17. I thought all these are really good. Communication is something that you have to keep working on, and there's so many different angles to look at it. But leave this lesson with this one thing in mind. I am going to communicate better to my spouse. I am going to communicate better to my spouse, because that, friends, is going to solve our conflicts. Thank you for your attention this evening.